Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, March 2nd, 2022, and today we're going to be talking about the state of Utah and potentially how it could become a competitive state between a Republican and not a Democrat, but actually an independent. Now, you might be surprised to see the state of Utah as the topic of today's video simply because Utah is one of the most partisan states in the nation. Taking a look at every single election dating all the way back to 1964, the state of Utah has been in every single circumstance a solid red state. Literally speaking, you have to go back to 1964, which was the last time, actually 68, sorry, not 64, 68, which was the last time, or yes, 64 was correct. I don't know why it ended up glitching on my part, but 64 was the last time Utah went blue, right? And when looking at our margin here over the past 20 years, the state of Utah really doesn't seem like it has any expectation or future indication that it will go blue. George W. Bush won here by 41 points. He won again in 2004 by 46 points. 2008, it narrowed down to a 28-point victory. 2012, it expanded to a 48-point victory, rapidly decreased in between 2012 and 2016 to an 18-point victory for Trump by the independent who is now running for Senate in the state of Utah, who got a significant portion of the vote there. And then that was a lasting effect on the state of Utah, in which in 2020 only went to President Trump by 21 points without an independent on the ballot there, which means that Joe Biden relative to Hillary Clinton gained about 10% of support from the state of Utah, and relative to Obama, about 15% in terms of support. So looking at the, or 13%, looking at the Senate election in the state of Utah, the Republican Party has an incumbent. This is not a circumstance in which there was a retiring incumbent, which is why this is quite a surprise. Mike Lee, elected back in 2016, you can actually see defeated Misty Snow as the incumbent Republican there, won with 68% of the vote, not at all competitive. There was an independent on the ballot who got 2.5% of the vote. What you can take away from this is that it was a 41-point victory on the same ballot that President Trump was only winning by about 18 points. So Mike Lee, in one way, you might see as someone who can defy expectations, who can outperform President Trump anytime that it mattered. And if President Trump won in 2020 by 20 points, 21 points actually, what's to say that Mike Lee won't win by an exceptionally large margin as he did in 2016? And I would bring up the point of his approval rating. Right now, Senator Mike Lee isn't exactly popular across the state. Just 42% of voters in Utah approve of his performance, whereas 38% disapprove. 21% of the state is either undecided or does not know how they feel about his approval rating right now, which isn't necessarily a good sign, especially for an incumbent Republican senator. And because there is that possibility that Mike Lee faces off against an independent, it only fuels this expectation that Utah might actually become competitive in 2022. Now, you might be wondering, okay, like 2016, there could be an independent on the ballot. When looking at the 2016 presidential election results, you see here that Donald Trump got 45% of the vote, but by margin, he won by 18 points. Evan McConnell being on the ballot was just split between Hillary Clinton and himself. Evan McConnell got some of that anti-Trump vote from the Republican side, and Hillary Clinton got all of the Democratic base. But there actually is an interesting thing going on in the state of Utah. The Democrats have yet to decide who they are going to nominate in their candidacy here. And right now, there is an incumbent, a frontrunner on the Democratic side, but beyond that, there really isn't much else to see. Looking at the major Democrat who could have ran was Ben McAdams, the former United States representative from Utah's 4th District, won in 2018 by a fraction of a margin, and then lost by nearly the same margin in 2020. He has since been drawn into a new 15% more Republican district, so the 4th District really isn't viable. So it looks like he might decide to run for Senate. But instead he said, no, I'm actually endorsing not the Democratic frontrunner, but Evan McConnell. And he has been actively going to many Democrats across the state to try to petition them, the delegates that will vote at the state convention, and say that choose to nominate no one. Choose to nominate not a single person on the Democratic side and throw your party support behind Evan McConnell. And that's sort of the strategy that the Democratic Party looks like they might be inclined to take. Looking at the polling data in the general election between Mike Lee and a Democratic nominee, Mike Lee defeats them by astounding margins. 20 points here, 20 points here, with 30% undecided in a state that typically experiences a significant portion of the undecided vote going to the GOP. But when you include Evan McConnell, what do you find? you find that Evan McClellan actually outperforms the Democrat, does better than the Democrat. The Democrat only getting 11% of the vote in a three-way race. So why have the Democrat there? The Democrat realistically cannot win this election, but Evan McClellan may be able to. And if you don't think so, just take a look at some of these numbers. You add them together, either they're lagging behind Mike Lee by 2 points in the case that Steve Schmidt is the nominee, who is actually viewed as the stronger Democrat of the two, based off of the primary. Looking at the three-way race with the Democratic frontrunner, I believe, Cale Weston, you will find that Evan McClellan and his vote together defeat Mike Lee by about 2 percentage points. I think it becomes increasingly more clear that if you have McClellan, a Democrat, and a Republican on the ballot, the Republican will undoubtedly win. But McClellan will do better than the Democrat. That's why this is a moment of deliberation, a point of contention within the Democratic Party. And based off of what Ben McAdams has been saying, he says that his support for backing Evan McClellan has actually been near unanimous by the Utah Democratic Party. Utah has not had a Democratic senator elected in 28 years. 2022 is certainly not going to be one of those years, but there is a possibility that there is an independent elected. When you just take a look at the statewide name recognition that Evan McClellan has, he doesn't need to do much more work in the state of Utah. Him running for president in 2016 and getting 243,000 votes in the actual ballot, outperforming Gary Johnson when it came down to it in the state of Utah, did much better. The best performing third-party candidate in this entire election. It wasn't Gary Johnson in terms of a statewide percentage captured. Evan McClellan getting 22% of the vote is a testament to his ability to siphon away voters who are otherwise displeased with the Republican nominee. And what you are going to find is that amongst Republican voters in the state of Utah, just 57% approve of Senator Mike Lee, which means there is 43% of the Republican Party and 100% of Democrats who would be more inclined to vote for someone like Evan McClellan and replace Mike Lee. The thing about this is that it won't change the balance of power. Evan McClellan has been a long-standing Republican throughout his entire life. He switched from being a Republican to an independent merely to run against President Trump in the 2016 election. He has made a name for himself as a conservative. He has made a name for himself partially as a Republican. And knowing this, seeing the way that Evan McClellan has really traversed such an interesting political climate, he does have a very real shot at winning if he is to be backed fully by the Democratic Party. Because when you add up these numbers, one thing becomes clear. Mike Lee no longer is that frontrunner. That solid R ranking that we see from the Cook Political Report, Inside Elections, Sabato Crystal Ball, and Real Clear Politics likely could change. The Democrats could turn this around, but they must agree to not nominate a single person. As soon as a Democrat hits the ballot, it's game over. There is no chance. Democrats have messed up before. Democrats have been in this position where they have a red wave, for instance, 2014 being the example, where they have a candidate who they believe could defeat a Republican who is unpopular. This is 2014 we're talking about. Let's go ahead and take a look at the past elections to find it. And it's an election where the Democratic Party agrees not to nominate anyone and decides to back this independent instead, saying that this independent would have a realistic chance at winning. Here's the thing. Looking at the state of Kansas, which is the state with this exception, you find that Pat Roberts, the incumbent here, won by 11 points. Now, Greg Orman made a name for himself. He was able to get 43% of the vote as an independent. He did not declare whether or not he was going to side with the Democrats or the Republicans in the United States Senate. It was very clear that he was truly an independent, and he got 43% of the vote, and that's pretty significant. 43% in a state that Democrats routinely lost by 15, 20, 25 points. It was a very good margin. In fact, the state with the longest streak in terms of current history right now, the longest streak up until now, with the last time, the latest to elect a Democrat, was the state of Kansas. I'm probably not explaining that well. The state of Kansas is a state where they haven't elected a Democrat since 1932 to the United States Senate. And they wouldn't have, in this circumstance, had the independent won. But the fact is, he got closer than many other Democrats. And he did so being an independent. But then Democrats ultimately didn't end up getting a victory for their unwillingness to run a candidate. But then again, were they really going to win in the first place? Personally speaking, as someone who views this from an analytical lens, I would advise the Democratic Party to go forward with not nominating anyone. While I am a firm believer that parties should run candidates in all of their races because it does excite voters, it does drive up turnout for your respective side, I think that in this specific case, it's just advisable for the state of Utah Democratic Party. Looking at what could be done with Evan McClellan on the ballot versus a Republican, you put yourself in a better position. You put yourself in a position where you could actually see Evan McClellan winning. Now, McClellan is by no means at a super high chance of victory. He's higher than the Democrats, but he's by no means at a super high point. It makes sense. The state of Utah is still a red state through and through. The polling data from 2016 seems to suggest that McClellan won't perform as well as he's expected, about a 4-point drop-off relative to 2016, and that Republicans will perform better than expected. And I think a lot of that goes into political thinking. A lot of that goes into our understanding of the state of Utah and our expectations about the final results. My main thing is that the state of Utah at this point in time doesn't like President Trump, right? They don't necessarily approve of him in the way that other Republican states might. And people closely associated with him, like potentially Senator Mike Lee, they tend to push back on. There's a reason why Mitt Romney did 30 points better than Trump in the state of Utah. There is a reason that happened. It wasn't because they really didn't like Obama. It was because they really liked Romney. There's a reason why McCain did over 20 points better. They really liked McCain. They really liked Bush. Why? Because they were traditional Republicans. The state of Utah, I think, values things a little bit differently than the rest of the country. It's a state with a high Mormon population, and consequently, a state that probably has a different type of standings in terms of values and moral beliefs than a state that might not necessarily have a majority Mormon population. It does help for Mitt Romney's case that he is Mormon, but John McCain isn't. George W. Bush isn't. Seeing them perform 20, 30 points better than Trump is telling me something. It's telling me that Trump himself was the problem. His strategy to take non-politically correct stances, to take extremist stances, where he's insulting, where he's attacking, these are things that pushed away Utah voters and pushed them to Evan McClellan. And I think right now we are seeing Evan McClellan tap into that name recognition. And it says here that he has actually outpaced every other candidate, including the incumbent Republican, when it comes down to fundraising, as of the most recent quarter. Isn't that telling you something? There is some type of support there. So, looking at the approval rating of Mike Lee, looking at the GOP approval rating as well, you can take away that Mike Lee isn't necessarily popular. Looking at the general election polls, it doesn't look like Mike Lee is going to have a very solid victory in the general election either if he's facing off against Evan McClellan and a Democrat, or potentially just Evan McClellan. One other point that I should bring up is that Mike Lee, being unpopular, is threatened to lose his own GOP primary. The other Republicans aren't doing super well, but Mike Lee is being put in a position where he's only getting about 50%, of the vote. 50%. Still good, and, still significant amount undecided that could likely move over to him. But, seeing that potentially there could be some consolidation behind one person over Mike Lee, it is entirely possible that he does get a run for his money in the Republican primary. The fact that an incumbent senator, anyone in Congress, should have an easy time going through a primary. That's why it's such big news whenever there is a House Democrat primary, a House Republican primary. Things like that are big news because congressional races are where primaries really hold a lot of weight. And in the Senate race, and in every Senate race across 2022's map, you are finding that almost all of the incumbents are walking to renomination and potentially re-election. That is not the case for Mike Lee. So it looks like everywhere you look, whether it's the Republican primary, whether it's his approval rating amongst Republicans and amongst the general populace, whether you're looking at general election polling data, whether you're looking at fundraising data, whether you're looking at prior election data from 2016 and 2020, one thing is evident. Independents like McClellan seem to be doing well, seem to be polling well, seem to have performed well in the past. In addition to that, Trump as a candidate, Trump as someone to be associated with, is not a popular stance, popular position in the state of Utah. And that needs to be recognized. Mike Lee is going to be associated super closely to President Trump by McClellan's camp. The Democratic Party is going to evaluate whether or not they want to run a nominee for Senate or not. I would advise that they don't, but again, that is entirely up to the Democratic Party, which obviously I'm not part of the Utah Democratic Party. I will say that what my expectation is, April 23rd is the day that they do vote and make a decision about this. I do think they will not nominate someone. I think Ben McAdams is right. The consensus here is nearly unanimous. Do anything you can to prevent a Republican elected. And that's exactly what has been the motto for Democrats in many of these safe red states. Democrats have not won a Senate election here, might I remind you, in 28 years. And 2022 is not going to be the year that breaks that streak. But potentially, as maybe Democrats might have hoped back in 2016, that the combined vote of the Democrats and the independents could propel an independent, in specific, Evan McMullin to victory. Had Hillary Clinton had siphoned all her votes away to Evan McMullin, shifted them all over, Evan McMullin would have won the state of Utah. The combined vote between the Democrat and the independent was more than President Trump as the Republican nominee. And keep in mind, 4 years prior, the state of Utah went to Mitt Romney by 48 points. Very interesting race, if you ask me, and we will see what happens with Evan McMullin later down the line. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.